All right, hello everybody. It's time for the final body episode of of our examination of Locke's second treatise of government. We'll probably do one more week after this just to kind of gather our critiques together from a kind of a libertarian or voluntarist perspective on where Locke falls short. But this is chapter 19. This is the last chapter of the second treatise, and it is titled, as I mentioned before, of the Dissolution of Government. This is kind of where Locke brings it all together and says that under certain circumstances, the government, isn't doing its job, is actively attacking the people. And there are reasons why the government may dissolve. There are reasons why a society may dissolve. And there are reasons why a government may dissolve without the society underlying it dissolve. All right, so let's get to it. So the first point that Locke makes in this chapter is that we do need to distinguish between the dissolving of society versus the dissolving of government. Society is merely the agreement of a group of people to act as one body for their own defense, basically, for their own positive effects, to maintain their property, to maintain to serve as arbitrator of disputes between them, kind of thing. This is, of course, one of those places where I'm sure that Rousseau loved Locke's statement about kind of society being the will of the people here. And it's worth noting that there really isn't a will of the people, and especially that will of the people isn't just 50% plus 1 versus 49 versus 50% minus 1, right? Like if there is a will of the people, which there kind of isn't, right? There's no like collective consciousness that a group of people has simply by virtue of the fact that they're close to each other, right? There could be cultural reasons why a group of people could get together because they hold certain principles for themselves to be sacrosanct, right? But like this is one of those places where Locke is kind of overstepping, or at least being vague enough that people like Rousseau can take and pervert his concepts into something even worse, or something absolutely deleterious to human freedom. Locke says that the most common way that societies are dissolved is by conquest from the outside. There's a group of people, they're kind of doing their own thing, someone comes in and conquers them, and then kind of incorporates them into its own population in a certain way, right? And that's where a society dissolves. This group of people that agreed on X, Y, and Z are now being kind of intermingled or commingled with this group of people that don't necessarily believe in X, Y, Z. And so the society that forms as a result is going to be different as just a matter of course. It's worth noting that this doesn't seem to really be true anymore. What seems to be happening these days more is that governments are stabler over long periods of time. And so what seems to be happening is that a government is kind of more dividing its own population, dividing its own society into a group that is served by the government and a group that is unserved or anti-served by the government. And those two groups then kind of develop rivalries, basically. Either they're fighting over the control of that 50% plus 1, or whatever it is that they need to have legislative capabilities in the government, and trying to kind of minimize the abilities of the other team. That seems to be kind of the way things are going for the most part these days, both in the US and in Europe, right? The governments aren't dissolving, but the societies beneath them are splintering, and part of the reason for that is because of the acts of government which exceed the abilities of the abilities of government that Locke admits to, right? These governments are doing things outside of the purview of what a group could do, what a group could agree to, and by doing this, they're kind of tyrannizing one group for the aggrandizement of another group. So Locke notes that if a society dissolves, right, if this group of people decides that they're going to go their separate ways, going to return to the state of nature with respect to each other, that the government must dissolve too. That's kind of obvious. But Locke notes that there are ways for governments to dissolve without societies dissolving beneath them. That is, a group of people still agree that they want to, combine their power into some kind of legislative body, but that legislative body itself collapses for whatever reason, but those people still want to be part of the same society. So, number one, Locke starts to talk about the dissolution of the legislature by usurpation. And he uses a very particular term here called, that is, quote, altered or alteration. He also uses another term called umperage, and that kind of lends us with a little bit of insight as to how Locke views the fundamental usefulness of government. Government as umpire, as arbitrator, so that no man may be his own judge. We've talked about this from the very beginning of the second treatise all the way up until now, and that principle has maintained itself as something that Locke is saying, this is what government, this is one of the things that government is for. The other thing would be the protection of property. So, but this term altered gets used a lot more in the next couple of sections, because what he's basically saying is that if the system is altered in some way without the consent of the people, then that system is no longer a valid system of government. If the legislature decides that it's going to, of its own volition, decides that it's going to enact laws that it's not supposed to enact, if it's going to elect its representatives in a different way without the consent of the people, and these kind of things alter the form of government. And alteration without consent of the people is de facto illegitimizing, right? At least in Locke's perspective. Locke notes again that people are not bound to obey usurpers. And there's a quote in here that I think is worth kind of talking about for a second. Here we go. Quote, "For the essence and union of the society consisting in having one will, the legislative, when once established by the majority, has the declaring, and as it were, keeping of that will. The contribution or constitution of the legislative is the first and fundamental act of society, whereby provision is made for the continuation of their union under the direction of persons, and the bonds of laws made by persons authorized thereunto," yada, yada, yada. But again, this is one of those phrases that I think people like Rousseau have taken from Locke and kind of twisted it, because there is no unity of life to make the Commonwealth. There's a group of people that have some common interests, right? And Locke is exaggerating here on how unified the people have to be to form a society or a government. They can agree on very little, and as long as they, as long as they propose that the government is limited enough in scope that it doesn't trot on anyone's feet, then they can still form a society and a government, right? And even if a group of people get together, there's still the natural limits of government that Locke recognizes that someone like Rousseau does not. And so where Locke is saying, well, the majority plus one can make certain laws that affect everyone equally, that don't single any particular person or small group out, right? They have to be within the powers of a group of people that they would be able to give up, vis-a-vis each other, kind of thing. They can't just say that because 50% plus one agrees to tyrannize the remainder of the people, the bare minority, that's valid, right? In Locke's system, government has fundamental limits, which although they're a little bit foggy based on the use of reason, that people do have good faith disagreements about, there are certain limits beyond which the government is not supposed to go in a Lockean system, whereas Rousseau kind of just says, he kind of harkens back to the old days of direct democracy, where 50% plus one could exile people if they felt like it, and Locke is saying, well, the majority does have some powers, but those powers are limited. Rousseau is like, the majority has its own magical special will, and that will commands everyone else, and has the ability to kind of tyrannize small minorities if they so desire. In a Lockean system, the government must be protective of property, must be an arbitrator preventing people from judging their own cases. When it fails to do this, it is illegitimate by definition. In a Rousseauian system, that's not the case. So, Locke then moves into kind of a detailed example. He's using Britain as an example. He's saying, well, we have a king who holds the executive power as well as some minor legislative abilities, such as convening the legislature when it needs to be done, making sure that members of the legislature do actually attend legislative sessions when they're in session. And then we have two bodies of legislation. We have the House of Lords and the House of Commons, where the House of Lords is hereditary and the House of Commons is elected by the people. And he's going to talk at length for a good chunk of this chapter about the different ways that this government, if it were so constituted, can fail, can dissolve itself. So let's go through those relatively, because the argumentation here isn't very difficult. So we're just going to go through these rather quickly. For instance, if the king or prince makes laws outside his authority, he alters the government. He illegitimizes the government. If the king or prince hinders the assembly of the legislature, if he tries to prevent them from meeting together to pass a law that might limit his powers, for instance, or limit his prerogative in a specific way, right? That alters the government. And remember, alters means illegitimizes in this particular, way that Locke is formulating it. If the king or prince changes the method of election arbitrarily, that alters the government. If the king or prince or the legislature delivers the people to a foreign conqueror, that alters the system, right? Now, one point that Locke makes here that I think I'm going to dispute a little bit here is that the king or the prince, and he basically says the reason he's talking about the king or the prince doing these things is because the king or the prince is the one who's in the best position to do so. Nowadays, that's not really the case. The legislature does, in fact, have the ability to kind of collude against the people, as we've seen just in certain ways that the legislature says, oh, this is what the Constitution means. The judicial system says that's what it means, and we're going to go with that, so we're going to move forward on that basis. Locke is kind of failing here to predict kind of this great usurpation that we find ourselves in today, where all three branches of the government collude together to expand their own powers for their own, for their own selfish means, for their own selfish ends. And so this is one of those things where Locke is not predicting things quite as clearly as he might have been able to. Another possibility. The king or prince might refuse to execute the laws. That alters the system. It illegitimizes the system. Locke notes here that there is no government without laws. And there's a part here in section 219 that I thought was worth kind of worth quoting. Quote, "Where the laws cannot be executed, it is all one, as if there were no laws. And a government without laws is, I suppose, a mystery in politics, unconceivable to human capacity, and inconsistent with human society." So Locke is kind of, I think we've definitely had some philosophical advancements beyond that. I think that Rothbard and Hoppe's conceptions of private societies don't exactly have laws. De Jasse talks about torts rather than like criminal or civil violations, right? He talks about being able to than compared to rights, right? De Jasse says torts, not rights, and he says there has to be some kind of legitimately identifiable action, whether direct or indirect, that causes harm in order to have people, in order to have a judge, claim restitution from person A to person B. This is something that is entirely kind of a common law, a natural law approach, which, is not quite the same as like a positive legislative approach, right? We can now imagine a system where judges, don't have a written body of laws necessarily, but rather that in most cases, judges are chosen by two parties who are contracting with each other as an unbiased third party, and there's no law in that kind of system where two people contract with each other and they say, if we have a dispute in this contract, we go to this guy. This guy doesn't have a body of laws. He has some precedent which he may or may not apply, and that's going to kind of be a market function. But, this is something where Locke is not quite as, where I think we've made some advances in the notion of natural and common law and in non-positivist legal proceedings that I think are valuable and are worth looking into. But again, that's not the scope of this particular thing. Maybe I'll talk about that some other time. Okay, so Locke has just listed a bunch of reasons why the government might alter itself, might dissolve its authority. And he notes that when dissolution occurs, what can happen is that the people, if they choose to continue their society, may provide for themselves and elect a new legislature. The society has the right to preserve itself, is kind of the way he puts it. And there's all kinds of problems with using the word rights in a collective sense. This is part of the reason why De Jasse wrote a lot of his essays, because he's like, this rights, terminology is very is very easily twisted to nefarious purposes, and so maybe we need to think about how often we use this justification of rights. But here Locke is basically saying that society has a collective right to preserve itself, which is also a little bit more permanent than I think a voluntarist or a libertarian might, conceive things. There may be small parts of a society that say, hey, you guys have changed your minds on this in the last generation, and we're not interested. We view this particular principle as sacrosanct, and the fact that you guys have changed your mind about it and now oppose us on it means that we don't want to be in society with you. This should be something that there's kind of a peaceful resolution to that. And Locke is way too permanent about how societies have to be. We'll see a little bit more of that later. Continuing. Locke notes a weakness of what he's said so far, is that Locke is basically saying this dissolution can only occur after the government has screwed up in a really big way, right? They've already delivered you to the hands of a conqueror, kind of thing. They've already enacted laws that enslave you in a very real way. And so he says, okay, well, clearly this can't be the only reason why a government may dissolve. There must be something short of curtains that enables a government to be dissolved and the people to choose another group of legislators. So he talks about this next. Locke basically says that if high-ranking, that is to say, members of the legislature, members of the princely class, in whatever sense that applies into a particular system, that if those agents act contrary to the trust that has been given to them, to the responsibilities as leaders or rulers, that if they act contrary to that trust, they also dissolve their own authority. Society creates the government to secure and protect itself. Locke has said this over and over again. This has been his kind of one of his fundamental principles of the purpose of legitimate government, is that it's for a society it's for a group of people that agree on a bunch of stuff to secure and protect itself from people judging for their own selves in disputes that involve themselves, and to protect them from people encroaching from outside. When the government acts to the detriment of society, it puts them into the state of war with the people. We've heard this a couple of times throughout the book. But basically, if the government starts to, be especially troubling with private property, then that will put them into the state of war with people. Locke notes a couple of kind of forces that put the government at odds with the people. Quote, ambition, fear, folly, or corruption. These things are all things that are justifications for people to say, hey, this is not, this government is no longer legitimate, is no longer serving our ends. Another thing that Locke says is, indicative of a government losing its authority is signs that it is grasping at absolute power. So if a government seems to be trending in the direction where its power becomes unlimited, then that by itself, it doesn't have to make it all the way there, but just kind of the people seeing that trend is reason enough for the government to be dissolved. When this happens, when the government dissolves because of this kind of preemptive, hey, we see the collapse coming and we're cutting it off right now, what happens is that the power to choose the legislature devolves back to the people, and the people get to choose a new government, or to institute a new government. In Section 222, there's a long list of disqualifying acts by the executive that I think are worth kind of looking at here. Here we go. Quote, "What I have said here concerning the legislative in general holds true also concerning the supreme executor, who, having a double trust put in him, both to have a part in the legislative and the supreme execution of the law, acts against both, when he goes about to set up his own arbitrary will as the law of the society. He acts also contrary to his trust when he either employs the force, treasure, and offices of the society to corrupt the representatives and gain them to his purposes, or openly pre-engages the electors, and prescribes to their choice such whom he has, by solicitations, threats, promises, or otherwise, won to his designs, and employs them to bring in such, who have promised beforehand what to vote and what to enact, thus to regulate candidates and electors, and new model the ways of election. What is it but to cut up the government by the roots and poison the very fountain of public security? For the people having reserved to themselves the choice of their representatives as the fence to their properties, could do it for no other end, but that they might always be freely chosen, and so chosen freely act and advise as the necessity of the commonwealth," etc., etc., etc. So basically, Locke is saying there's all kinds of stuff that the primary executive can do that inviolates his what would you call it? His claim to legal protection and claim to the ability to even execute laws. So, if you want a long list of these disqualifying acts, Section 222 is where to go. All right, a little bit of a hiatus there. I had to go do some other stuff, but we are getting right back to it. So I just finished talking about the long list of disqualifying acts by the executive from Section 222. What Locke covers next is he goes on to talk about the question that a lot of people might have here is, well, won't this make governments too unstable as a matter of course? Won't it be rebellion after revolution after dissolution over and over and over again? Locke makes a few points to explain why he doesn't believe this is the case. Number one, people will stick to old forms and bear the faults of existing frames rather than replace the frame, until things get pretty bad in general. One of the downsides of governments being so stable over the last couple hundred years, for instance, especially on the generational timescale, is that these small tyrannies, these small usurpations, can be forgotten or end up baked in as common knowledge kind of thing. Like, oh yeah, shall not be infringed doesn't mean shall not be infringed. Necessary doesn't mean necessary. General welfare doesn't mean general welfare. These kinds of things get baked in, by bad legal precedent, and the people don't fight back because it's such a small little thing. It's just this little tiny thing, affects 1% of people. It's not a big deal. Nobody really cares that much. Even the 1% who are affected are like, well, it's not that big of a deal. We got other things to worry about. And then that 1% becomes 5%, 10%, 50, 100%. And, by that point, this happens so slowly that people will be like, well, this is just how it's always been. Again, one of the points of Locke's, system of epistemology is the idea of tabula rasa, right? That people are born without any, express knowledge of what their rights are, for instance. And so they have to be taught, right? And so it's not very hard for a clever tyrant or an organization of clever tyrants to convince people that they have fewer rights, fewer natural rights than they actually have. And so every generation, a little bit gets chewed away at until you end up in the situation where we're at now. Not a great situation. But continuing with the summary of Locke, Locke notes that the persistence of the system of king, lords, commons is evidence that people are unlikely to break the framework when there's some slight problems with it, that they'll be more willing to maybe toss out one king, evict one prince, get rid of one corrupt politician, rather than simply topple the whole system. He notes, for instance, that even though some people have been deemed unworthy of being the King of England, in general, they haven't moved the line to a different line of nobility, to a different line of royalty, for hundreds of years. And so he says, this is actually a lot stabler than people are willing to admit for the most part. Next question. Is this too conducive to rebellion? So Locke notes that if people are really miserable, Even if the government is doing things that it's supposed to be doing, if what the government is doing is making the people miserable, that they're probably going to revolt anyway. That these small mismanagements don't generally foment revolutions because there's a bit of, benefit of the doubt given to government agents. Even large ones can pass over time. There's a quote here that's fun. Quote, "But if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under, and see whither they are going, it is not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves and endeavor to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was at first erected." Do you notice that language there, though, right at the start of that quote? A long train of abuses. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Locke notes that there needs to be a trend to this injustice, that there needs to be kind of a visible design of not just a tiny part of the government, but a significant chunk of the government being corrupted to the point where they're aiming for more power than they're supposed to have in order to foment an actual revolution, and often even that's not enough, as we've seen in the last couple hundred years of history. Locke notes that the case of tyranny is actually worse than anarchy in this particular sense. It gives you the same inconveniences. That is to say, your property, your life, your rights are no longer protected, but the remedies are further off. If you are suffering under tyranny, you need to first dissolve the tyranny, then establish a new government. If you're just simply in anarchy and you're in this situation, yeah, the inconveniences are similar, but all you have to do is establish the government. There's nobody to cast down in order to get out of anarchy if you so desire to. So, Locke continues to note that the doctrine that tyranny and usurpation justify revolt is a powerful force to keep government in its place. That tyranny and usurpation are best seen themselves as a form of rebellion, right? When the government agents take over powers that they're not supposed to have, what they're actually doing is they're rebelling against the system that they agreed, they swore an oath to defend. And so the notion that the people who are rebelling against these corrupt officials are rebels is actually a misnomer. In fact, it is the government agents who are overreaching and tyrannizing people, usurping power, who are the rebels. Yeah, those who remove or alter legislations or the legislative system introduce the state of war, and they themselves are guilty of breaking down the frame of the government. Locke notes that to deny the right to oppose tyranny and usurpation is to deny all rights of self-defense, that if you can't stop a government agent acting lawlessly, then you can't stop a robber acting lawlessly either. You've given up that right, and the right of self-defense is the first rule of nature. It is not something that you can give up. It's not something that's alienable in that sense, at least. There's a quote here. Here we go. Quote, "If the innocent, honest man must quietly quit all he has for peace sake, to him who will lay violent hands upon it, I desire it may be considered what a kind of peace there will be in the world, which consists only in violence and rapine, and which is to be maintained only for the benefit of robbers and oppressors. Who would not think it an admirable peace betwixt the mighty and the mean, when the lamb, without resistance, yielded his throat to be torn by the imperious wolf?" He also makes the reference to the story of Ulysses in Polyphemus's den, where basically, I believe Polyphemus was a cyclops who was just eating Ulysses' men and saying that this is his right to eat his men, basically. Yeah, it is not a reasonable position, Locke is contending here, to assume that man is simply going to lay down his life for the strongest man who wishes to oppress him. In fact, that's the entire point that Locke is trying to get away from in his system of government. Remember, Locke wants government by consent. He doesn't quite make it, but he's trying to get government by consent to get away from might makes right, just with extra steps. Continuing with our summary here. Locke says that it is better for rulers to face occasional opposition than for men to be continuously and forever ground under tyranny. That the government itself is to blame for bringing the widespread suspicions upon themselves by doing things that make people suspicious that they are going to try for an absolute power grab. That act itself, the one that creates a suspicion, is the incorrect act, and that the government is wrong for doing that, and the people are right for seeing it as a justification for resistance. There's a little extra comment I wanted to make here that one problem that we've been talking about repeatedly here is the permanence of dominion, and how that permanence of dominion is the root of many of the problems in the Lockean system. Valid contracts must have either an exit clause, or they must be made under a framework that implies an exit clause, a default exit clause, right? That's why we have a law about breach of contract, so that people don't have to say this is the penalty for breaking this contract in each contract. It's kind of a Band-Aid, right? Because it might be better for, contracts that are only worth $100 to have a weaker exit clause than contracts that are worth $1 million. But at the same time, I think the law, just recognizes the value of certain contracts. But the point is that a person making a contract in the legal framework of the United States, for instance, or any other country, knows that there are certain, or ought to know, I hope, that there are certain laws about what happens if you breach a contract, assuming that no specific clause is in the contract to describe what happens during a breach. And in fact, a social contract must have, or if we want a social contract to be valid, it has to have some kind of way out. A contract that doesn't have a way out is not really a contract. It's more like a binding, slave contract, which we could talk about the possible validity or invalidity of that later, but let's set that aside for the purposes of this summary. Locke continues by noting that he who lays the foundation for overturning a constitution is guilty of a great crime, whether that person be a person who is unjustly, promoting revolution, or a government official who is being corrupt and promoting the suspicion that then damages the frame of the Constitution. Locke continues by stating that magistrates acting in violation of the law may, and by implication should, be resisted. Otherwise, those who are given power by laws are also allowed to break those very laws that give them the power. It's a logical contradiction to, get special powers from the law and then also break the law on top of that. Now, here is where the giant Latin paragraphs are found in the thing, and what they actually are is they're quotes of Berkeley, who is a asserter of the power and sacredness of kings. But what Locke is going to get at here by looking at these two passages from Berkeley is that even though Berkeley supports the divine right of kings and the right for kings, or rather the expectation that kings have to be obeyed, right? What Berkeley is going to get at here is something that Locke is going to draw out into the point that there are times where you can defend yourself against the person who was the king, and that's the real trick. Okay. Berkeley says that self-defense is permitted against kings, and reparations are also permitted against kings if kings do damages. But you're not permitted to attack the king, and you're not allowed to take punitive penalties. You can get back what he took, but you can't get back more than that, even though under a normal circumstances with a regular person, you can get damages plus, some punitive reward. And also that self-defense must be done with reverence or with respect kind of thing. Locke notes that it is kind of silly, impossible to defend without striking back. That to defend without the possibility of striking back is kind of meaningless. It just means that you die tired, right? And that striking with reverence is similarly, impossible or nonsensical. Secondly, Locke notes that the use of force, that is to say unjust force, by kings puts those kings into a state of war with the people they are harming. And the state of war admits no natural hierarchy. Basically, the king, by doing something against, the law, has unkinged himself. He has put himself on the level of the lowest commoner, and the lowest commoner may defend himself against another commoner who happens to be harming him or trying to take his stuff without legal reasoning. Berkeley gives two more cases for unkinging here. Number one is that when the king tries to overturn or ruin the government or the commonwealth. He gives examples of Nero and Caligula, where they were like, yeah, I'm going to burn down Rome and I'm going to go off to somewhere and just kind of chill for the rest of my life. It's like, well, no, you're not going to be allowed to do that, right? And Berkeley, even Berkeley is like, well, this is perfectly reasonable to knock him out of kingness and find somebody else. And number two, if or when the king makes himself subordinate to another. And he says that there's evidence of stuff like this happening in the Scotch Annals, which I'm not too familiar with, but anyway, you can look it up if you want. So Locke notes that in the end, the people shall be the judge, both of government and of when the state of war is enacted. The controversy between or some, if there is some controversy between the prince and some group of people, that controversy cannot be decided by the prince, but it should be decided by the entirety of the people, not necessarily the people who are in the conflict with the prince, but everybody else, should be like, well, it's, the prince is right, or these people are right. Again, this is part of Locke's notion that no man may be his own judge. And here, Locke makes the last point, which is that the power of government may dissolve, and people may may build a new government while maintaining their society, but that the power of society lasts as long as society does. Government lasts as long as the legislature does. Locke also notes that the legislature may unseat itself in many ways and forfeit power, but it does that in pretty much the same ways as the executive. And in fact, we see the legislative basically overstepping its bounds, tyrannizing people today, and that would be plenty of justification for the people to assume that legislature is no longer legitimate. And that's the end of the book. It's worth noting, I think, that Locke is putting a lot of power into society, a lot of permanence into society that I think is not strictly necessary. If a government dissolves, the question might be whether all the members of the society want to continue to be members of that society, because there could be cases where some majority is kind of not like terrorizing, but lightly tyrannizing some minority. And it may be that when that government dissolves, that the minority says, well, clearly you guys don't have our best interests at heart. Clearly, we're still a minority, but I don't think that we should have to be under the same government. There's no government that you're going to make that's going to protect our rights. And so, this is one of those things where I've said it before and I'll say it again, but having an exit clause in your social contract is a great relief valve for this. Because if people have created a government or created a society, and what ends up happening is that some small group ends up deciding, hey, this is not serving our purposes anymore. I mean, it did when we started, but it's been a few generations, and our circumstances have changed. We think we can do better on our own. In Locke's system, the government needs to be dissolved, and then the society needs to be dissolved, and that's something that pretty much, according to Locke, only happens with warfare. But if this dominion was not permanent, if this society could splinter itself, that would solve that problem, the problem of persistent minorities and them seeking justice for themselves, whether for reasons that the majority respects or not, right? But that's it. That is chapter 19, the final chapter of the second treatise of government. We will conclude next week with an overview of where Locke overstepped government by consent. I'm going to basically do a quick review. It'll be a short one, but it'll be a quick review of all the problems with Locke's system from kind of a voluntary perspective. We're going to recover prerogative, we're going to recover dominion, we're going to recover consent, we're going to recover Locke's concept of implied consent. We're going to talk a little bit about stuff like that. So that's kind of the plan. and then we will be done with this book, and I'll move on to the next project, wherever that happens to be. So yeah, that's all I've got for you for this week. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you know what to do. And I hope you have a good week, rest of your week. And I'll see you later. Have a good one.